Digging into his backyard to plant a new tree, Nolan unearthed something far from roots or rocks. A tarnished, seemingly ancient necklace. Intrigued by the find, he took it to a local jeweler, expecting to hear it was just a piece of costume jewelry forgotten by time. The jeweler's hands trembled as he examined it, his eyes wide with disbelief as he muttered, "This can't be true." "What is it?" Nolan asked, his curiosity piqued. He was hoping the necklace might be worth a decent sum, enough to buy the new shovel he had his eye on. "You have no idea what you found, do you?" the jeweler responded, his voice carrying a hint of something unsettling. Nolan felt a sudden unease and wanted to grab the piece out of the jeweler's hand. But the jeweler stepped back. "This needs to be seen by someone else," he suddenly said, and he reached for his phone on the counter. Nolan was stunned, but there was nothing he could do. "You need to come to my shop." "Now," he heard the jeweler say on the phone. But who was he talking to? "Can't you just give me my money?" Nolan tried. The jeweler laughed. "This piece does not belong to you," he suddenly said, his voice soft. Nolan saw him clutching the piece of jewelry tightly, so tight that his knuckles began to turn white. Nolan wanted to leave, but not without that piece. So he jumped over the counter. But why was this piece so important? Who did it belong to? And why was the jeweler so secretive about it? Living in the city, Nolan wanted to make the most out of his small garden. That was why he began to plant fruit trees. He had already planted a pear tree and wanted to place an apple tree beside it when he suddenly hit something while digging a deep enough hole. "What the?" he stammered as he whipped off the dirt. It was a gold necklace with a bright red stone in the middle, and it looked like it could be worth a lot of money. A rush of adrenaline raced through Nolan's body as he realized he could have just found millions of dollars in his backyard. He quickly ran inside and rinsed the rest of the dirt off the necklace. "Oh my God!" Nolan yelled as he held the necklace with both hands while jumping around his kitchen like a little child. "I'm rich! I'm rich!" But little did he know, it wasn't that black and white. He decided to go to a jeweler right away, as he couldn't wait any longer. If only he had looked up the necklace online first. He walked into the shop with a big smile on his face, ready to find out how rich he had actually become. There was a small line of people wanting to sell their jewelry, but nothing could ruin his day after finding that necklace. While waiting for his turn, he even began to hum softly, to the annoyance of the other people in line. "Can you shut up?" a man in front of Nolan said angrily. Nolan stopped, as he didn't want to get smacked in the face, but it didn't dim his happiness. Finally, it was his turn, and he placed the necklace on the jeweler's counter. "I'd like to know the worth of this piece," he said hopefully. The jeweler didn't look impressed at first, until he began to inspect the necklace up close. He held the necklace close to his face and looked at it with wide eyes. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Nolan said, but the jeweler stayed quiet. He hadn't shown this interest in any other customer's jewelry, so Nolan almost began to grow worried. Suddenly the jeweler stammered, "This can't be true," and Nolan's stomach fluttered. "What do you mean?" he asked hopefully. The jeweler paused as he clutched the necklace tightly. He then reached for his phone and began to call someone. Nolan's happiness was slowly making space for worry, as it didn't look like he was getting the necklace back. He heard the jeweler urge someone to come to his shop, and suddenly, Nolan felt like something strange was going on. The jeweler urgently instructed everyone in the shop to exit, creating a tense atmosphere. "Everyone needs to leave. Now," he said, his voice firm. Customers exchanged puzzled glances but complied, muttering under their breaths as they shuffled toward the door. Nolan felt the tension mount as the shop cleared out. What was so special about the necklace? The jeweler locked the door behind the last customer, leaving Nolan feeling trapped and uneasy. Nolan hesitated by the door, glancing around anxiously as the last customer left. He felt a chill in the air, an ominous weight settling over the shop. "What's going on?" he muttered, his eyes darting to the jeweler. The jeweler ignored him, focusing on his phone. Nolan's heart raced. Should he leave? His feet felt rooted to the spot, curiosity and fear battling within him. He approached the counter, trying to engage the jeweler about the necklace's sudden importance. "Can you tell me what's happening?" Nolan asked, his voice shaking slightly. The jeweler looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Just wait," he said curtly. Nolan frowned, frustration bubbling up. "I deserve to know what's going on with my necklace," he insisted, trying to keep his voice steady. The jeweler's silence only heightened his unease. The jeweler remained tight-lipped, insisting on waiting for a specialist's evaluation. "I can't say anything until the expert arrives," he stated firmly. Nolan's patience wore thin. "You can't just leave me in the dark," he argued. The jeweler shook his head. "This piece is beyond anything I've ever seen. We need the specialist." Nolan sighed, feeling the weight of uncertainty. The minutes dragged by, each one increasing his anxiety. Nolan, feeling a mix of intrigue and nervousness, stood alone in the now quiet shop. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional ticking of a clock. He paced back and forth, his mind racing with possibilities. What could be so extraordinary about the necklace? He glanced at the jeweler, who was now busy arranging tools on the counter. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Nolan checked his phone, hoping for a distraction. Concerned, Nolan quickly texted his friend Olaf about the suspicious situation at the shop. "Hey, something weird is going on here," he typed. "The jeweler won't tell me anything and kicked everyone out. Can you come over?" He hit send, hoping Olaf would understand the urgency. He felt a bit better reaching out. Moments later, his phone buzzed with a reply. Nolan sighed in relief, knowing Olaf would help him figure this out. Olaf replied promptly, promising to join Nolan so he wouldn't face the situation alone. "Hang tight, I'm on my way," the message read. Nolan's nerves settled a bit, knowing his friend was coming. He kept glancing at the door, waiting. The jeweler continued fiddling with his tools, seemingly oblivious to Nolan's growing anxiety. The minutes felt like hours as Nolan stood there, feeling slightly less alone but still very uneasy. Upon arrival, Olaf attempted to enter the shop, but the jeweler refused him entry. "I'm here to see my friend," Olaf said, pointing at Nolan through the glass. The jeweler shook his head. "No one else can come in," he said firmly. Olaf frowned, frustration evident on his face. "He's my friend. I need to be with him," Olaf insisted. Tichy jeweler stood his ground, leaving Olaf outside. Nolan watched from inside as Olaf argued with the jeweler at the door. "Let him in!" Nolan shouted, but his voice was muffled by the glass. The jeweler ignored him, continuing his argument with Olaf. Nolan's heart pounded as he saw his friend gesturing angrily, pointing towards the door. "He's just trying to help," Nolan muttered to himself, feeling helpless. The standoff at the door only made him more anxious. Feeling more isolated, Nolan's worry intensified as he stood watching the standoff. The shop felt eerily quiet, the tension almost tangible. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, wishing Olaf could break through the barrier. The jeweler's stubbornness was infuriating. Nolan's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What was so special about the necklace? He glanced back at the counter, then returned his gaze to the door, feeling more alone than ever. Suddenly, a man in sunglasses bypassed Olaf and entered, claiming to be the expected expert. "I'm here for the necklace," he said confidently, ignoring Olaf's protests. The jeweler seemed to recognize him immediately and nodded. "Yes, come in," the jeweler said, his tone respectful. Nolan watched in shock as the man strode into the shop, exuding an air of authority. Olaf stood outside, looking both angry and confused. The jeweler welcomed the mysterious man, ignoring Olaf's protests. "This is the specialist," the jeweler explained to Nolan, but his voice carried a note of finality. Olaf banged on the glass door, shouting, "Let me in! This isn't right!" The jeweler barely glanced his way. Nolan felt a growing sense of dread. Who was this man, and why was the jeweler so deferential to him? The situation was getting stranger by the minute. As Nolan started to dial 911 for help, the man swiftly snatched the phone from his hand. "What are you doing?" Nolan exclaimed, trying to grab it back. The man gave him a stern look. "No calls," he said flatly, pocketing the phone. Nolan's heart pounded. This was more than just about the necklace. He glanced at the jeweler, who looked surprisingly calm, almost as if he had expected this turn of events. Two burly men appeared, locking the doors and pulling a bewildered Olaf inside. "Hey, what's going on?" Olaf protested, struggling against their grip. Nolan's anxiety spiked as the men forced Olaf to stand beside him. The shop felt smaller, the air thick with tension. The jeweler watched silently, while the man in sunglasses seemed to take charge. "Stay calm," he instructed, his voice cool and commanding. "Everything will be explained soon." Trapped, Nolan and Olaf exchanged worried glances, realizing the gravity of their situation. The shop was now a fortress, with no escape in sight. "What do they want?" Olaf whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Nolan shook his head, feeling helpless. The man in sunglasses and the jeweler were huddled together, whispering urgently. Nolan's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. They were in deep trouble, and there was no easy way out. Inside the locked shop, the tension soared as the stranger examined the necklace closely. The man in sunglasses turned the piece over in his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. Nolan and Olaf watched silently, their unease growing with each passing second. The jeweler hovered nearby, waiting for the man's verdict. The room felt stifling, the air heavy with anticipation. What could be so important about this necklace? Nolan's mind raced. The man whispered about the necklace's significant implications to the jeweler. Nolan strained to hear, catching only fragments of their conversation. "Historical value, unique markings, dangerous," the man murmured. The jeweler nodded gravely, his face pale. Nolan's anxiety spiked. What kind of mess had he stumbled into? He glanced at Olaf, who looked just as worried. The whispers continued, each word adding to the mounting sense of dread. Nolan and Olaf, feeling uneasy, tried to overhear the hushed conversations. They edged closer, hoping to catch more details. "What do you think they're saying?" Olaf whispered. Nolan shrugged, keeping his eyes on the pair. The man in sunglasses spoke urgently, his tone serious. "We can't let this fall into the wrong hands," he said. Nolan's stomach churned. Whatever was happening, it was clearly more than he had bargained for. Despite their efforts, the true value and story of the necklace remained elusive. Nolan and Olaf exchanged frustrated glances, unable to piece together the cryptic clues. The man in sunglasses and the jeweler were deep in discussion, their voices too low to decipher. "This is crazy," Olaf muttered. "What could it be worth?" Nolan shook his head, feeling the weight of their ignorance. The mystery of the necklace loomed larger than ever. The air thickened with secrecy and suspense, making Nolan and Olaf increasingly anxious. They stood awkwardly, the room's atmosphere pressing down on them. The jeweler and the stranger continued their intense conversation, oblivious to the growing tension. Nolan wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, his mind racing with unanswered questions. "We need to know what's going on," he whispered to Olaf. But the longer they waited, the more isolated they felt. As time dragged on, Nolan and Olaf eventually sat down, feeling powerless. The tension was unbearable, and their initial defiance faded into helplessness. They slumped into the uncomfortable chairs, exchanging anxious glances. "What do we do now?" Olaf whispered. Nolan shook his head, his mind a jumble of worries. The man in sunglasses and the jeweler continued their secretive discussion, oblivious to Nolan and Olaf's growing despair. The man with sunglasses approached Nolan, beginning to question him about the necklace's origin. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and intense. Nolan swallowed hard, glancing at Olaf before answering. "In my backyard, buried in the dirt," he said. The man's eyes narrowed. "Tell me everything," he demanded. Nolan felt a chill run down his spine. The air seemed to thicken around him. Nolan disclosed everything about discovering the necklace in his backyard. "I was digging to plant an apple tree," he began, his voice trembling. "I hit something hard, and when I dug it out, it was this necklace." The man listened intently, nodding occasionally. "Did you notice anything else unusual?" he pressed. Nolan shook his head. "No, just the necklace." Olaf watched, his expression mirroring Nolan's anxiety. The mysterious men then demanded Nolan take them to his home to explore further. "We need to see where you found it," the man in sunglasses said firmly. Nolan hesitated, glancing at Olaf. "Do I have a choice?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The man's stern look was all the confirmation he needed. "Let's go," Nolan sighed, feeling trapped. The men gathered their things, ready to follow Nolan. Reluctantly, Nolan agreed, realizing he had little choice in the matter. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling like lead. Olaf placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," Olaf whispered. Nolan nodded, trying to muster some courage. The group moved toward the door, the tension palpable. As they stepped outside, Nolan took a deep breath, bracing himself for what lay ahead. Nolan led the group to his backyard, where the man with sunglasses grabbed a shovel. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the garden. Nolan's heart sank as he watched the man start digging where he had found the necklace. Olaf stood beside him, looking equally worried. "I can't believe this is happening," Nolan whispered. The man's movements were purposeful, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. With a mix of dread and helplessness, Nolan watched as they started digging. Each shovel thrust felt like a violation of his sanctuary. "They're going to destroy everything," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The other men stood guard, their eyes scanning the surroundings, making sure no one interrupted. Olaf squeezed Nolan's shoulder. "Hang in there," he said softly. But Nolan felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. The men's intimidating presence made it clear resistance was futile. Nolan's garden was at their mercy. Every shovel full of dirt tossed aside felt like a personal loss. Nolan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout. "This is insane," Olaf said, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man in sunglasses remained focused, his expression unreadable. Nolan knew there was no way out but to let them continue. As the digging continued, Nolan mourned the potential ruin of his well-tended garden. Plants he had nurtured for years were being uprooted and tossed aside without a second thought. "My poor garden," he whispered, feeling tears prick at his eyes. Olaf stood silently beside him, sharing his pain. The sound of shovels striking dirt was relentless, echoing in the quiet evening. Nolan's heart ached with every strike. Despite his concerns, the situation escalated beyond his control. compelling him to comply. The men showed no signs of stopping, their determination unwavering. Nolan felt a sense of powerlessness wash over him. "Why us?" Olaf asked, his voice shaking. Nolan had no answers. All he could do was watch as his garden was torn apart. The realization that there was nothing he could do to change it was crushing. Suddenly, the man stopped digging and started excavating more delicately with his hands. He brushed away the soil carefully, his movements precise and deliberate. Nolan and Olaf exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what had prompted the change. The other men watched intently, their expressions serious. "What's he found?" Olaf whispered. Nolan shook his head, his heart pounding with curiosity and fear. The man's focused attention suggested something significant. He unearthed a gold ring matching the necklace, stunning everyone, including Nolan. The ring glinted in the fading light, its intricate design unmistakably linked to the necklace. "No way," Nolan breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man held the ring up, examining it closely. "This changes everything," he murmured. Feeling a shift in the atmosphere, Nolan offered the men refreshments, trying to ease the tension. "Would you guys like something to drink?" he asked, his voice shaky but polite. The men exchanged glances, then nodded. "Water would be good," the man in sunglasses said. Olaf looked at Nolan, eyebrows raised in surprise. Nolan shrugged slightly. "Be right back," he said, heading towards the house. Olaf followed close behind. As he went inside, Olaf followed, questioning Nolan's unexpected hospitality amidst the chaos. "What are you doing?" Olaf hissed. "Why are you being so nice to them?" Nolan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm just trying to calm things down," he explained. "Maybe if we show some kindness, they'll explain what's going on." Olaf frowned but nodded. "Okay, but let's be quick," he said, glancing nervously back at the garden. Inside, Nolan and Olaf quickly grabbed water, but remained wary of their guests' intentions. Nolan filled a couple of glasses at the sink, his hands trembling slightly. "This is insane," Olaf muttered. Nolan nodded, his mind racing. "We need to stay on their good side," he said quietly. "Who knows what they'll do if we don't?" They hurried back outside, carrying the water, unsure of what awaited them next. Their indoor conversation was abruptly interrupted by a shout from the garden. "Get out here, quick!" the man's voice rang out. Nolan and Olaf exchanged alarmed looks before rushing towards the door. The urgency in the man's tone made their hearts race. They spilled out into the garden, adrenaline pumping, to find the man kneeling on the ground, his hands full of glinting objects. Nolan's eyes widened in disbelief. Rushing outside, they found the man had discovered more jewelry and gold coins. The small pile glittered in the dim light, each piece more ornate than the last. "This is incredible," Nolan muttered, his breath catching. Olaf bent down, eyes wide with astonishment. "Where did all this come from?" he asked. The man in sunglasses looked up, his expression triumphant. "There's more where this came from," he said confidently. Overwhelmed by the finds, the man declared the need to extensively dig up the garden. "We need to search every inch," he announced. Nolan felt a mix of excitement and dread. His precious garden would be torn apart, but the promise of more treasures was intoxicating. "Are you sure?" Nolan asked, his voice shaky. The man nodded firmly. "Absolutely. We can't stop now," he insisted. Nolan's heart pounded in his chest. Realizing the scale of the excavation, Nolan consented, blinded by visions of wealth. "Okay, do it," he said, barely recognizing his own voice. Olaf shot him a worried glance, but Nolan was already imagining the possibilities. "Think of what this could mean," he whispered to Olaf. The men began to mark out areas for digging, their energy renewed. Nolan's thoughts were consumed by the glittering promise of riches buried beneath the soil. Heartbroken yet hopeful, Nolan watched as his garden was prepared for a thorough search. The plants he had nurtured were uprooted, the soil churned. "It's for the best," he told himself, trying to ignore the pang of loss. Olaf stood beside him, silent but supportive. The garden transformed into a chaotic dig site, the anticipation in the air palpable. Nolan's dreams of wealth kept him focused, despite the devastation around him. The excavation turned up various treasures, fueling Nolan's dreams of wealth. Each new discovery was more dazzling than the last: golden bracelets, ancient coins, ornate brooches. Nolan's eyes shone with excitement as he imagined his future transformed by this unexpected fortune. "This is unbelievable," he whispered to Olaf, who nodded, equally amazed. The men continued digging, their enthusiasm infectious. Nolan's heart raced with every glittering find, his dreams growing grander by the minute. After uncovering numerous items, Nolan inquired about his share of the finds. "So, how does this work?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "What do I get from all this?" The man in sunglasses glanced at the jeweler, who chuckled softly. "We need to discuss that," the jeweler said, his tone oddly light. Nolan felt a pang of unease. "I found it on my property," he added, trying to assert his claim. The jeweler chuckled and revealed the historical significance of the treasures. "These aren't just ordinary valuables," he began, a hint of amusement in his voice. "They're part of a lost collection from the 18th century. Nolan's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" he asked, his excitement mingling with confusion. "It means," the jeweler continued, "that these items are priceless artifacts with immense historical value." Nolan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He explained that the found items were state property, tied to a centuries-old hunt. "These treasures belong to the state," the jeweler said firmly. "They were part of a royal collection lost during a historic event. By law, they must be handed over to the government." Nolan's heart sank. "So, I get nothing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The jeweler nodded. "I'm afraid so," he said, not unkindly. Nolan, shocked and disheartened, learned that the treasure was destined for a museum, not his pockets. "This can't be real," he muttered, feeling the weight of disappointment settle over him. "All this for nothing?" Olaf placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "At least it'll be preserved for history," he offered. Nolan nodded numbly, struggling to process the news. His dreams of wealth shattered, replaced by a sense of profound loss. Feeling deceived, Nolan managed to retrieve his phone and immediately called the police. His hands shook as he dialed. "I need to report something," he said urgently. The operator listened as Nolan explained the situation. "Please hurry," he added, glancing at the men still in his garden. Olaf looked on, his expression grim. Nolan hung up, his mind racing. He hoped the authorities could bring some clarity and justice to this mess. The arriving officers conducted a brief investigation into the jeweler's claims. They listened to the jeweler's explanation and inspected the artifacts closely. "These appear to be authentic," one officer said, nodding to his partner. Nolan watched anxiously, his heart pounding. "Is there any way I can keep them?" he asked, desperation in his voice. The officers exchanged looks before continuing their assessment, leaving Nolan in a painful limbo. It was confirmed. The artifacts were indeed historical and belonged in a museum. "These items are part of a lost royal collection," the officer explained to Nolan. "They're considered state property." Nolan's heart sank. "So, I really get nothing?" he asked, voice cracking. The officer shook his head sympathetically. "I'm afraid not," he replied. Nolan felt a wave of disappointment wash over him, realizing the treasure would never be his. Nolan was left to face the reality of the situation. The treasure wasn't his to claim. The officers and the jeweler spoke quietly, finalizing the details. Olaf stood by Nolan, offering silent support. "At least it's going to be preserved," Olaf said softly. Nolan nodded, trying to find solace in the thought. "I just thought maybe it could change everything," he muttered. The reality was harsh, but there was no changing it. Disappointed but resigned, he watched as his find was authenticated and taken away. The officers carefully packed the artifacts, preparing them for transport. Nolan's garden, once a place of peace and hope, now felt like a battlefield lost. "It's over," he whispered to Olaf. His friend nodded. "Let's get inside," Olaf suggested. As they turned away, Nolan took one last look at the spot where his dreams had briefly glittered, then faded away. With the treasure gone, the jeweler and his team prepared to leave Nolan's property. They gathered their equipment, speaking in low tones. Nolan stood by, watching them pack up. "Thank you for your cooperation," the jeweler said, though his words felt hollow. Nolan nodded silently. The yard, once bustling with activity and hope, now felt empty and quiet. The reality of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. Olaf, trying to offer comfort, gave Nolan a supportive pat on the shoulder. "Hey, you did the right thing," he said gently. Nolan forced a small smile. "I guess," he replied, though his heart wasn't in it. Olaf stayed by his side, offering quiet support. "At least they're gone now," Olaf added, looking around the yard. Nolan nodded, appreciating his friend's presence in this difficult moment. As the last of the visitors left, Olaf quietly exited, leaving Nolan to reflect alone. "Take care," Olaf said softly before heading out. Nolan watched him go, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The garden was a mess, much like his thoughts. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence envelop him. The excitement and chaos of the day faded, replaced by a deep sense of loss. Nolan, now alone, closed the door behind Olaf with a sense of finality. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet house. He leaned against the door, closing his eyes for a moment. "What now?" he whispered to himself. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence almost oppressive. He wandered to the window, looking out at the garden. It was time to figure out how to move forward. After some time, the treasure hunters sent Nolan a modest sum for his garden's restoration, acknowledging their guilt. The check arrived in a plain envelope, along with a brief note of apology. "It's not much, but it's something," Nolan thought, staring at the amount. He sighed, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness. He knew it wouldn't bring back the dreams he'd had, but it was a small step towards healing.